In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
In the 41st millennium, death is a commodity. Souls fuel the Emperor's endless vigil. Blood oils the Imperium's war machine. Bodies are currency spent without thought across 1,000,000 battlefields. But what happens when something arrives that has already died, consumed death, and made immortality its weapon? What happens when the galaxy's cruelest era meets a monster who has spent centuries bored? The breach opened above Sanctum Angelus, a shrine world whose entire purpose was devotion. 17 billion souls knelt in prayer across marble cathedrals that pierced the clouds. The Sisters of Our Martyred Lady maintained their eternal vigil, their power armor gleaming in processions that wound through streets paved with the bones of saints. Here, faith was absolute. Here, the Emperor's light banished all darkness. The warp storm that tore reality above their world was not absolute. It screamed crimson and midnight black, colors that had no business existing in the same space. Seers across 3 sectors collapsed, bleeding from their eyes, babbling about something else, not chaos, not order, but a third thing that rejected both categories. The breach lasted 17 seconds. What fell through it appeared on no augur array, triggered no defense systems, and made no sound. Until it hit the Cathedral of Eternal Ascension at terminal velocity. The impact crater was 300 meters across. Marble and gold and the bones of 10,000 martyrs vaporized into powder that hung in the air like fog. Seismic sensors registered the equivalent of a lance strike from orbit. Emergency klaxons wailed across the district. Sisters of battle assembled with bolt pistols and flamers, surrounding the crater in disciplined ranks, expecting demons or heretic drop pods. Instead, they found a man in red. He lay at the crater's center, motionless, impaled on 7 broken marble pillars that had punched through his torso. His coat, impossible crimson, the color of fresh arterial spray, spread around him like wings. His hat had somehow survived intact. Slowly, impossibly, his head turned. Yellow eyes opened behind orange-tinted glasses, and Alucard smiled. "Well," he said in a language none of them had ever heard but somehow understood, his voice like velvet wrapped around razors. "This is new." The pillars withdrew from his chest with wet, squelching sounds. Flesh knitted itself back together in defiance of biology, physics, and the Emperor's natural order. He sat up, brushed marble dust from his coat, and looked around at the assembled sisters with the expression of a man who had just woken from a pleasant nap. "Tell me," he continued, rising to his feet with inhuman grace. "Where am I? And more importantly..." His grin widened, revealing teeth that were definitely not human. "Who's going to try to kill me first?" Sister Superior Cassandra had served for 43 years. She had burned cultists on 17 worlds, purged 3 demon incursions, and once executed her own mother when the woman showed signs of corruption. Her faith was absolute. Her hand did not shake as she raised her bolt pistol. "Abomination," she declared, her voice amplified by her armor's vox grill. "By the authority of the Adepta Sororitas and the God Emperor of mankind, I name you heretic and demon. You will be..." He was in front of her before she could finish the sentence. Not running, not teleporting. Simply there, as though the space between them had ceased to exist. His hand wrapped around the barrel of her bolt pistol, and when she pulled the trigger, the mass-reactive rounds detonated inside the weapon. The explosion should have shredded her arm. Instead, his hand absorbed the blast, smoke curling between his fingers. Demon? Alucard tilted his head, genuinely curious. Is that what you call anything you don't understand? How? Limited. Cassandra saw her death in those yellow eyes. Every instinct screamed that she was facing something older than her order, older than the Imperium itself. But faith was stronger than instinct. "Sisters," she roared, "purge the unclean!" Holy Prometheum erupted from a dozen flamers. Bolt rounds screamed through the air. Blessed chainswords revved to life. The Sisters of Battle brought the Emperor's wrath in concentrated, disciplined fury. Alucard stood in the center of the firestorm and laughed. The flames washed over him, blackening his coat but not consuming it. Bolt rounds punched through his chest, his skull, his limbs, and the holes closed faster than they opened. He didn't dodge. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, arms spread, drinking in the violence like fine wine. "Yes," he shouted over the roar of weapons fire. "That's it. Show me what you've got. Show me if this world has teeth." When the ammunition ran dry and the flamers sputtered, he was still standing. His coat was in tatters. His flesh was a ruin of burns and bullet wounds. And he was smiling wider than before. Then his body began to repair itself. Not slowly, not gradually. Reality itself seemed to reject the damage, snapping him back to perfection like a rubber band released. In 5 seconds, he was pristine again. Cassandra felt something she hadn't experienced since her first combat drop 4 decades ago. Fear. "My turn," Alucard said pleasantly. He moved like liquid shadow, and suddenly 3 sisters were missing their heads, arterial spray painting the sacred marble. He hadn't drawn a weapon. His hands had simply passed through them, and they ceased to be whole. 4 more tried to engage in melee, chainswords screaming. He caught one blade between his palms, snapped it like kindling, and used the broken half to impale its wielder through her armor like it was paper. This wasn't a battle. This was a demonstration. Cassandra activated her Vox. "Command, this is Unit Seraph 7. We have contact with... Words failed her. How did you describe this? Requesting immediate reinforcement, requesting inquisitorial presence, requesting... Everything you have? Alucard finished for her, suddenly behind her, his breath cold on her neck. Yes, do that. Bring me everything. He didn't kill her. That would have been mercy. Instead, he simply walked away, toward the cathedral proper, leaving her alive to bear witness. Around her, 37 sisters lay dead or dying, their blood forming rivers in the cracks between sacred stones. The last thing Cassandra saw before shock took her was the monster in red, pausing at the cathedral's entrance, looking up at the massive aquila carved above the doors. A 2-headed eagle, he mused. How appropriately pretentious. Then he walked into the Emperor's house uninvited. And somewhere in the warp, something that might have been laughter echoed across impossible distances. If you crave stories of cosmic collisions where unkillable monsters meet an empire built on faith and brutality, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the dark millennium. But Alucard protects nothing but his own amusement. The Inquisition arrived with the subtlety of an orbital bombardment. 3 hours after the cathedral massacre, the entire district had been cordoned off by Arbite's riot troops in full suppression gear. Civilian populations were evacuated with the efficiency born of millennia of practice, which meant thousands died in the crush. But the administratum would file those deaths under acceptable losses and move on. Gun servitors took up positions on every rooftop, their multi-barreled weapons tracking movement with dead optical sensors. And at the center of it all, Inquisitor Covenant arrived aboard a Thunderhawk gunship that bore the seal of the Ordo Hereticus. He was a tall man, rail-thin, his face a patchwork of rejuvenate scars that gave him the appearance of a corpse wearing someone else's skin. Augmetic eyes glowed with pale green light, cycling through spectra invisible to baseline humans. His rosette, the symbol of his ultimate authority, hung from his neck like a noose made of gold and adamantium. Behind him came his retinue, 3 death cult assassins moving like shadows, a tech priest whose mechadendrites clicked and whirred with barely contained aggression, and a sanctioned psyker in chains so thick they could anchor a tank. Covenant looked at the crater, at the blood painting the sacred stones, and at Sister Superior Cassandra, who sat wrapped in thermal blankets despite the warm air, still shaking. "Describe it again," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. The tone of a man who had seen every horror the galaxy offered and found them all equally tedious. He laughed, Cassandra whispered. Her faith was intact. That was the terrifying part. She still believed, still trusted in the Emperor's plan. But she had seen something her belief system had no category for. "We hit him with everything. Full strength, blessed rounds. Holy promethium consecrated by Saint Dominica's own relics." He laughed, Inquisitor. He laughed and asked for more. "Demon," the tech priest Magos Kelth declared. His voice was more machine than human, synthesized through vox grills implanted in his throat. "Warp entity manifesting pseudo-physical form. Recommend immediate banishment protocols and subsequent exterminatus if no." Covenant raised one hand. Sister Cassandra's report specifies the entity bled. Demons don't bleed. They dissipate. This is something else. The Psyker, a woman whose eyes had been replaced with psychically sensitive crystals, suddenly convulsed in her chains. I can feel it," she gasped. "Inside the cathedral, it's wrong. All wrong. Not chaos, not holy, not living, not dead. It's a paradox, Inquisitor. It shouldn't exist, but it does, and it's hungry." Alucard's voice echoed from the cathedral entrance. Every weapon swiveled toward him. He stood framed in the archway, backlit by votive candles that had somehow remained burning throughout the carnage. His coat, completely restored, no trace of damage, hung around him like a living thing. He had found wine somewhere in the cathedral, a bottle of sacramental vintage meant for high feast days, and was drinking directly from it, with the casual disrespect of someone who had never been taught to fear anything. "Hungry," he repeated, savoring the word. "Not for food, not for blood, though, that helps." He took another long drink, then tossed the bottle aside. It shattered on the marble. "For entertainment. And you?" His eyes fixed on Covenant. "You look like you might actually be interesting." Covenant made a gesture. The death cult assassins moved. They were gene-crafted killers, enhanced with forbidden chemicals and trained from birth in 10,000 ways to end human life. They crossed the distance in complete silence, their neuro-gauntlets crackling with disruption fields designed to scramble nervous systems on contact. One went high, 2 went low, a synchronized assault that had killed everything from Chaos Champions to renegade Astartes. Alucard didn't move until they were within striking distance. Then his form simply dissolved. Not teleportation, not super speed. His body became shadow, became mist, became something that existed in the space between solid and incorporeal. The assassin's strikes passed through empty air. Before they could adjust, he reformed behind them, solid again, and his hands were already moving. The first assassin's head separated from her shoulders so cleanly the wound didn't bleed for 3 full seconds. The second managed to scream before Alucard's hand punched through her chest and pulled out her still-beating heart. The third, the fastest, the smartest, had already activated her refractor field and was backflipping away, her neural whip lashing out to entangle his arm. He caught the whip one-handed. The electrical discharge that should have flash-fried his nervous system made his smile widen instead. "Oh, that tickles," he said, and pulled. The assassin flew toward him like she weighed nothing. His other hand closed around her throat. For just a moment, he held her suspended in the air, her feet kicking uselessly, her eyes wide with the first real terror she'd experienced since her training had been completed. "You're all so fragile," Alucard observed, tilting his head. "Like porcelain dolls playing at war. Where's the sport in this?" "Enough," Covenant said. His voice carried psychic weight, amplified by a hexagrammic word tattooed on his tongue. The word hit like a physical force, a command that compelled obedience on a neurological level. Lesser beings would have dropped to their knees, their wills subsumed. Alucard blinked. Then he dropped the assassin, not from compulsion, but from genuine surprise. Well, he said, his tone shifting from bored to intrigued. "You have teeth after all. A psyker, yes? No, not quite. You use their power, but you're not one of them. How delightfully hypocritical." "I am Inquisitor Hadrian Covenant of the Ordo Hereticus," Covenant declared, stepping forward despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run. Fear was the mind killer. Faith was the answer. "By the authority vested in me by the God Emperor of mankind, I command you to identify yourself and state your purpose on this holy world." Alucard considered this. Around him, the blood of the dead assassins began to move, flowing upward in defiance of gravity, drawn toward him like iron filings to a magnet. The streams of crimson absorbed into his coat, disappearing, and Covenant realized with mounting horror that the entity was feeding. "Alucard," he said finally. "My name is Alucard. As for my purpose..." He spread his arms, encompassing the cathedral, the planet, perhaps the entire sector. "I have no idea where I am or how I got here. I was fighting a Vatican-sponsored army of zealots, and then there was a tear, a wound in the world. Something pulled me through." "The warp," Magos Kelth interjected. "Dimensional breach. Entity claims extra-universal origin. Probability rating, 17%. More likely explanation, chaos corruption, attempting to..." "I am not," Alucard interrupted, his voice suddenly cold enough to freeze helium. "One of your demons." The temperature dropped to 20 degrees. Frost formed on the marble. The gun servitors' targeting systems went haywire, their weapons swiveling randomly as their machine spirits recoiled from something their programming couldn't categorize. The chained psyker screamed and started bleeding from her nose. "He's telling the truth," she gasped. "Emperor preserve us, he's telling the truth. He's not from the warp. He's not from anywhere in this reality. He's foreign, Inquisitor. He's a disease this universe has no immunity to." Covenant processed this with the cold calculation of a man who had made apocalyptic decisions before. If this entity truly was extra-universal, it represented either the greatest threat or the greatest opportunity the Imperium had encountered in millennia. Possibly both. "You killed 37 of the Adepta Sororitas," Covenant said. "Imperial servants. Faithful warriors. Give me one reason I shouldn't order this entire district leveled with you in it." "Because you can't kill me," Alucard replied simply. "You can try. I encourage you to try. But I have been staked, shot, burned, drowned, crushed, vaporized, and torn apart by entities that make your worst nightmares look like children's stories. I have consumed the souls of millions. I have walked this existence for over 500 years, and nothing has managed to make death stick. He took a step forward. Covenant's hand moved to the plasma pistol at his hip. But more importantly, Alucard continued, because I'm bored. Magnificently, catastrophically bored. And this place. He breathed in deeply, tasting the air, the faith, the industrial decay, and desperate hope that permeated every molecule of the Imperium. This place smells like war, endless war, the kind that never stops, never rests, never shows mercy. His smile was no longer playful. It was hungry. So here's my counteroffer, Inquisitor. Try to kill me if you must. Send your armies, your champions, your blessed weapons. I'll destroy them all and dance in the ruins, or... He paused, letting the word hang. You can tell me about this empire of yours, about its enemies, about whether anything in this reality can give me what I truly want. And what is that? Covenant asked, against his better judgment. A worthy death, Alucard said. Or failing that, a worthy war. Covenant didn't order the bombardment. That alone told Alucard that the Inquisitor was either very brave or very calculating. Probably both. Instead, the man did something unexpected. He invited Alucard to his command rhino for discussion. The transport was cramped, utilitarian, its interior walls covered in purity seals and hexagrammic wards that made Alucard's skin tingle unpleasantly. Not pain, exactly. More like static electricity, a constant low-grade irritation that suggested the universe itself was trying to reject his presence. He sat across from Covenant, the Psyker still in chains between them, while Magos Kelth monitored everything with 17 different augmetic sensors. You claim to be extra-universal, Covenant began without preamble. Explain your nature. Alucard smiled, showing teeth. I'm a vampire. The last vampire, if we're being technical. I have consumed every other member of my species, absorbed their power, their memories, their very souls into myself. Where I come from, that made me the ultimate predator. Abomination, Kelth muttered, his mechadendrites coiling defensively. Yes, Alucard agreed pleasantly. But an abomination that serves. I was bound by magic, by contract, by will, to serve an organization that hunted supernatural threats. The Hellsing organization. They aimed me at vampires, at ghouls, at things that go bump in the night, and I eliminated them with extreme prejudice. Bound? Covenant's augmetic eyes narrowed. By what mechanism? Blood seals, ancient contracts written in lives and suffering. I chose my chains, Inquisitor, because absolute freedom is boring. Power without purpose is masturbation. He leaned back, the leather of his coat creaking. But then, something happened. A battle. An enemy trying to summon something. The ritual went wrong or right, depending on your perspective. And I fell through the cracks of reality into here. The Psyker suddenly convulsed, her crystalline eyes glowing with painful intensity. He's not lying, she gasped, but there's more. I can feel it. The warp knows him now. It touched him during the crossing, changed him, or tried to. His soul is wrong. Alucard finished for her. Yes, I've noticed. Your, what did you call it? Warp? It's interfering with my abilities. My regeneration is slower. My intangibility feels like pushing through molasses. And when I try to access the full reservoir of souls I've consumed, He trailed off, his expression darkening for the first time. When he continued, his voice had lost its playful edge. I can feel them screaming, not in fear, in hunger, as though something out there is trying to pull them from me, fragment them, consume them the way I consumed them. This universe wants to eat my power, Inquisitor. It wants to digest me and shit me out as something else. Covenant exchanged glances with Kelth. The tech priest's data slate was scrolling too fast for human eyes to follow. But the Magos' body language spoke volumes. Tension in the way his mechadendrites had gone rigid, defensive protocols clearly active. The warp is the Imperium, Covenant explained with the careful tone of someone lecturing on apocalyptic phenomena. The realm of souls and demons. It is chaos given form, entropy, madness, hunger without end. It reflects the emotional and psychic energy of all living things. But it is not alive. It is aware, and it corrupts everything it touches. Demons, Alucard mused. I've heard you mention them twice now. Tell me about these demons. Before Covenant could respond, the Rhino lurched violently. Alarms screamed. The Vox system crackled with panicked voices. Contact! Contact! We have multiple signatures manifesting directly. The roof of the Rhino tore away like paper. Things poured through the gap. They were vaguely humanoid, but where humans had skin, these had suppurating wounds. Where humans had hands, these had claws dripping with pus and poison. Their faces were studies in decay, flesh sloughing off to reveal bone and worm-riddled muscle. They smelled like gangrene and broken sewers. Plague bearers! Covenant roared, his plasma pistol already firing. Nurgle's chosen. Full purge protocols. The demons descended with gleeful moaning, their diseased talons reaching for flesh to rend and souls to corrupt. One landed directly on the psyker, its claws sinking into her shoulders. She screamed, and the sound was a psychic shockwave that made Alucard's teeth ache. He moved on instinct. His hand shot out, grabbed the demon by what might have been its throat, and pulled. The creature came apart in his grip, its flesh dissolving into black ichor that hissed when it hit the Rhino's floor. But unlike when he killed humans, nothing flowed into him. No essence, no soul, no substance. It was like trying to drink smoke. What the hell? Alucard muttered. Another demon lunged at him. He caught it mid-leap, his other hand producing the cassule from somewhere in his coat's impossible depths. The massive handgun roared, 13mm explosive rounds blessed with silver and sanctified by a Vatican that no longer existed in this universe. The demon's chest exploded, spraying warp stuff across the interior. It laughed. Even as its physical form began to dissolve, even as it lost cohesion and started fading back into the warp, the plague bearer laughed at him. A wet, bubbling sound full of diseased joy. Your weapons are meaningless, dead thing, it gurgled. We are eternal. We are beloved of Grandfather. We cannot truly die. We will return again and again, until all flesh rots and... Alucard shot it in the face 3 more times, more out of irritation than necessity. Covenant was on his feet now, his plasma pistol carving through demons with superheated fury. Kelth's mechadendrites had deployed hidden weapons, flamers, bolt pistols, even a crackling power fist. The tech priest fought with the cold efficiency of a machine, reciting binary prayers as he purged. But there were too many. For every demon destroyed, 2 more clawed their way through the tear in reality. The Rhino was filling with diseased monstrosities, and Alucard realized with growing frustration that his usual tactics weren't working. When he killed humans, he absorbed them. Their life, their memories, Their essence became fuel for his immortality. But these things? They had no essence to take. They were reflections, shadows cast by something incomprehensibly vast. Killing them was like punching fog. "They're not real," he snarled, snapping a demon's spine and watching in frustration as it simply reformed. "They're projections, manifestations. Where's the source?" "There is no source," Covenant shouted back, his plasma pistol down to critical heat levels. "They are chaos. They are the warp. They exist because they are believed into being by the emotions of..." A massive talon erupted through the rhino's side wall, large enough to belong to something the size of a battle tank. The metal peeled back like flesh, and through the gap, Alucard saw something that made even his centuries-hardened mind recoil. It was vast. A demon of such size that it dwarfed the buildings around them. Its body a mountain of rotting flesh covered in sores that wept rivers of filth. Its face was a single cyclopean eye surrounded by tentacles made of intestines. It reeked of entropy, of the heat death of the universe made manifest. "Greater demon," Covenant whispered, his voice carrying the weight of a man staring at his own death. "Emperor, preserve us. A great unclean one." The thing spoke, and its voice was the sound of civilizations collapsing into plagues and ruin. New soul, curious soul, delicious soul. Each word was a psychic assault that made reality ripple. "Grandfather Nurgle wants to taste you, dead thing that lives. Come, let us see how many times you can die before you understand the gift of decay." Alucard stared up at the abomination, at this thing that represented everything he'd never encountered before. An entity that couldn't be killed, couldn't be consumed, and operated by rules he didn't understand. And for the first time in 500 years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Uncertainty. His regeneration was already slower here. His powers were compromised by the warp's interference, and now he was facing something that existed partially outside the concept of death entirely. "Inquisitor," he said, never taking his eyes off the greater demon. "I'm going to need you to explain the rules of this universe very, very quickly." "There are no rules," Covenant replied grimly, ejecting his plasma pistol's spent core. "Only survival." The great unclean one reached for them with a hand the size of a building, and Alucard made a decision. He couldn't feed on these things, couldn't absorb them, couldn't add them to his power, but he could still destroy them. He just had to figure out how. Alucard launched himself at the great unclean one's descending hand with every ounce of supernatural speed he possessed. To Covenant's augmetic eyes, he was a crimson blur, a streak of blood and shadow that defied physics. The impact should have been like an insect hitting a tank. Instead, Alucard's fist punched through the demon's palm. Warp flesh parted around his arm, black ichor spraying in gouts that hissed and bubbled where it struck the ground. The greater demon bellowed, not in pain, but in delight. The sound was a psychic shockwave that shattered windows across 3 city blocks and sent mortals fleeing with blood streaming from their ears. "Yes, struggle, fight. It makes the rot so much sweeter." Alucard didn't waste breath on banter. He was learning, adapting, processing information at the speed only an apex predator could manage. These things couldn't be consumed, but they could be disrupted. Their physical forms were anchored to reality by something. Belief? Warp energy? Whatever it was, sufficient damage could force them back into whatever hell they'd crawled from. He pulled both hands free and drew his guns. The Kasul and the Jackal, hand cannons that had been forged in another universe with another reality's rules. blessed silver, mercury core rounds, ammunition designed to kill the supernatural dead. He'd assumed they'd be useless here, just metal and explosives. But as he fired, as the rounds tore through lesser plague bearers and reduced them to dissipating fragments, he realized something. His will still mattered. His intent still had weight. "Covenant!" he roared over the weapon's thunder. "These things, they're psychic constructs, yes? Manifestations of the warp," the Inquisitor shouted back, dragging the unconscious psyker toward cover. "Thought made flesh, emotion given form. Then they can be denied." Alucard holstered the jackal and reached into himself, into the screaming mass of souls he'd consumed over 5 centuries. The warp was trying to fragment them, pull them apart. But they were still his, bound by blood and contract, and the absolute authority he'd claimed over them. He forced them into coherence, compressed them, shaped them into... His shadow exploded outward. Not metaphorically. His actual shadow, cast by the burning buildings and emergency lumens, rose up like a living thing. It was black enough to hurt the eyes. A darkness so absolute it seemed to devour light itself. And from that darkness came things. Eyes, teeth, claws, the half-formed specters of everyone he'd ever consumed, given temporary semi-corporeality through sheer force of will. They weren't souls anymore. The warp had made sure of that. They were ammunition, weapons made of compressed death, and he could spend them. The shadow forms tore into the plague bearers with savage fury. Where demon met shadow, both annihilated each other in bursts of psychic feedback that registered on Auspex arrays 3 hives away. It was trading power for destruction, bleeding his reserves to match the warp's infinite army with finite but concentrated death. And it was working. "Clever," the great unclean one boomed, sounding genuinely impressed. "You understand. Everything here is currency. Everything can be spent. Grandfather would love you, dead thing. Join us. Let your precious souls rot into fertilizer for new horrors." "Pass," Alucard snarled and leapt. He covered 60 meters in a single bound, landed on the daemon's wrist, and ran up its arm. The flesh beneath his feet was simultaneously solid and liquid, real and not real, and touching it was like dragging his skin across broken glass soaked in acid. The warp's influence was stronger here, closer to the demon's mass, and he could feel his form trying to come apart. His regeneration was down to maybe 50% efficiency. The souls he was spending weren't replenishing. And worst of all, he could feel the warp learning him, adapting, finding the cracks in his existence to wedge itself into. But he'd faced worse odds. Probably. Maybe. He reached the demon's shoulder and fired the castle directly into its cyclopean eye. The bullet punched through the cornea and detonated inside. The great unclean one's head snapped back, and for the first time, it made a sound that might have been pain. Not much, just a grunt of mild annoyance. But it was something. "Not bad," it rumbled, its voice now coming from the dozen mouths that had opened across its torso. "But not enough. You cannot kill what is already beyond death. You cannot end what is eternal. You can only..." Alucard shoved his hand directly into the ruined eye socket and pulled. What emerged wasn't brain matter or demon flesh, but raw warp energy, screaming, chaotic potential that burned his fingers like acid and holy water combined. He pulled harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the way his hand was dissolving down to bone, and yanked out a pulsing mass of something that might have been a core or might have been nothing at all. Either way, when he crushed it, the greater demon shrieked. The sound was psychic agony that dropped mortals across the district into seizures. The massive body began to collapse. its flesh dissolving into black smoke that spiraled upward into the wounded sky. Alucard rode the dissolving mass down, his ruined hand already beginning to regenerate, slowly, painfully, but regenerating nonetheless. He hit the ground in a crouch, coat billowing around him, and looked up to see the last remnants of the demon being sucked back through a closing rent in reality. Around him, the surviving plague bearers were also fading, their anchor to the material realm severed. Covenant emerged from cover, his armor scorched and dented, his face grim. You banished a great unclean one in single combat, without psyker support, without sanctified weapons, without... He paused, seemingly at a loss. How? I'm very good at killing things, Alucard replied, examining his regenerating hand with clinical detachment. 3 fingers were still bone, but muscle was threading itself back onto the skeleton even as he watched. Though I'll admit, these demons are annoying. I can't absorb them, can't make them part of me. Fighting them is just expenditure, wasting power for no gain. That's the nature of the warp, Covenant said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who'd fought this battle for decades. It takes, it corrupts, it consumes. The only victory is banishment, and even that is temporary. They always come back. Unacceptable. The word was flat, absolute. Covenant looked at Alucard and saw something in those yellow eyes that made even an inquisitor uncomfortable. Not rage, not madness, but a kind of cold, calculating offense. As though the vampire had just been personally insulted by the fundamental laws of this universe. In my world, Alucard continued, his voice soft but carrying an edge that could cut souls, when I killed something, it stayed dead. Its power became mine. Its existence fueled my own. This waste. He gestured at the dissipating demon flesh. This is inefficient, pointless, a war that can never be won because the enemy never truly dies. Welcome to the 41st millennium, Covenant replied dryly. Hope you packed rations. Alucard was silent for a long moment, processing. Then slowly, his signature smile returned. But it was different now. Sharper, hungrier. More interested. Inquisitor, he said, tell me about this empire of yours. Tell me about the God Emperor you all keep screaming about. And most importantly, his eyes fixed on Covenant with laser intensity. Tell me where I can find more of these demons. Because if I'm stuck in a universe where my food doesn't stay in my stomach, I'm going to need to learn a whole new way to hunt. Covenant considered him for a long moment. A smart inquisitor would call for exterminatus, would cleanse this entire world to ash just to be certain this entity was destroyed. But Covenant hadn't survived 40 years in the Ordo Hereticus by being merely smart. He'd survived by being practical. You're going to need supplies, he said finally. Real supplies. This planet is a shrine world, useless for what you need. But 3 systems from here is Hive Aristeus. Population, 47 billion. Criminal underhives deeper than the rift itself. Gangers, cultists, mutants, and worse festering in the dark where the Emperor's light barely reaches. And? Alucard prompted. And if you're going to learn how to hunt in this universe, Covenant said, making a decision that would either save or doom entire sectors, you're going to need to feed. Not on demons, they'll just weaken you, but on humans, criminals, heretics, those already damned. He locked eyes with the vampire. I'm offering you a deal, Abomination. Hunt the darkness in the Emperor's name. Kill what needs killing. And in return, I don't reduce you to atoms. Alucard's smile widened into something that was almost genuine. "Inquisitor," he said, "I think we're going to get along beautifully." The voyage to Hive Aristeus took 6 days through the warp, and Alucard spent every moment of it learning just how much this universe hated him. Covenant's ship, the unrelenting Absolution, was a converted strike cruiser that reeked of incense, gun oil, and the particular smell of men who believed hygiene was secondary to faith. The Geller field, the only thing preventing the warp from tearing them apart during transit, made Alucard's skin crawl. Literally. He could feel it pressing against him, a psychic barrier that recognized him as something that didn't belong. The field registers you as a warp entity, Mygos Kelth explained. His mechadendrites adjusting instruments that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never heard of ergonomics. Your nature exists partially outside baseline reality. The machine spirits are confused, agitated. They want to reject you but cannot determine the appropriate protocol. "Tell them I'm touched," Alucard replied from where he stood at the viewport, watching the incomprehensible madness of the warp swirl past. Colors that shouldn't exist, shapes that hurt to perceive. And occasionally, faces pressing against the barrier, demon things curious about the anomaly aboard the vessel. He'd tried to sleep once during the voyage. That experiment had ended when he woke to find his shadow attacking him, animated by warp influence, his own absorbed souls trying to claw their way out of him and into the Imperium. He'd spent 3 hours forcing them back under control and had decided sleep was overrated anyway. By the 4th day, he was noticeably weaker. Not fatally so, but enough that even Covenant's retinue noticed. The death cult assassin he'd spared, a woman named Severine who'd apparently earned her survival through sheer willful spite, watched him with the intensity of a predator recognizing another. "You're deteriorating," she observed. She sat cross-legged on the deck, sharpening neuro-gauntlets that were already sharp enough to split atoms. "Without feeding. In my order, we learned that all predators must eat, even monsters." "I don't eat," Alucard corrected, his tone more irritable than usual. "I consume, I absorb. I make the essence of others into fuel for my own immortality. But here?" He flexed his hand, watching the movement with unusual care. "Here, I'm just, burning, using power I can't replenish. It's like breathing underwater, possible but not sustainable." "Then you need to feed before we arrive," Covenant said, entering the observation deck with his usual corpse-like precision. "Because when we hit Aristeus, I need you functional. The underhive there makes most war zones look civilized." "What's the plan?" Alucard asked, turning from the viewport. "Simple. I have reports of a cult operating in sub-level 97. They've been kidnapping children, performing rituals, and showing signs of chaos corruption. Local Arbites can't dig them out. The tunnels are too deep, too twisted. Enforcement squads go in, they don't come back." Covenant's augmetic eyes glowed brighter. "You're going to go in, eliminate the cult, and recover any surviving captives. Consider it a test. And the feeding? The cultists are already damned. Their souls are forfeit. What you do with them." Covenant shrugged, the gesture somehow making his already corpse-like appearance even more unsettling. "Is between you and whatever gods you pray to." "I don't pray," Alucard said flatly. "I am the thing prayers are meant to ward against." "Then you'll fit right in. Hive Aristeus was a monument to humanity's determination to survive in the most hostile conditions imaginable. The Hive City rose 20 miles into the toxic atmosphere, a spire of adamantium and rockcrete housing 47 billion souls stacked on top of each other like sardines in a can that had been welded shut and thrown into a furnace. The upper levels were gleaming spires, where the nobility lived in climate-controlled luxury. The mid-levels were industrial sectors where workers toiled in conditions that would make medieval serfs weep with envy. And the Underhive? The Underhive was where hope went to die. Alucard descended through access shafts that hadn't been maintained in centuries, following Severine, who'd volunteered to be his handler, as she navigated the twisted tunnels with practiced ease. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with moisture and the stench of human waste, chemical runoff, and decay. Sub-level 97 is contested territory, Severine explained, her voice filtered through her rebreather. 3 major gangs, 2 minor cults, and enough desperate refugees to fuel a small army. The cult we're after calls themselves the Covenant of Blessed Transformation. They worship something they claim will evolve humanity beyond the Emperor's design. Chaos? Probably. The Inquisitor's intelligence suggests Tzeentch, the changer of ways. They've been abducting children specifically, which means they're either sacrificing them or worse. They emerged into a chamber that might have been a water treatment facility 10,000 years ago. Now it was a shantytown built from rusted metal and human desperation. Fires burned in barrels, figures huddled in shadows, their eyes reflecting light like animals. The sound of dripping water mixed with distant screams and the omnipresent hum of ancient machinery. "Welcome to the bottom of the Imperium," Severine said. "Try not to get stabbed. The locals are unfriendly." As if summoned by her words, figures emerged from the shadows. Gangers, their bodies covered in crude tattoos and cruder augmetics. They carried stub guns, knives, lengths of chain with razors welded to the links. Their leader, a massive man whose lower jaw had been replaced with a mechanical vise, stepped forward. "New meat," he growled, his voice synthesized through Vox grills. "You got tolls? You got trade? Or you got blood?" Alucard looked at him with the expression of someone examining an insect. "I'm looking for the Covenant of Blessed Transformation. Tell me where they are, and you get to keep breathing." The ganger laughed. His crew laughed. The sound echoed through the chamber, and Alucard realized they'd drawn quite an audience. Dozens of desperate, violent humans emerging from the darkness, smelling weakness. "You hear this corpse-pale fucker?" the leader bellowed. "Thinks he can walk into our territory and make demands. I think we're gonna..." Alucard moved. One moment he was standing still. The next, his hand was through the ganger's chest, wrapped around his spine. The man's mechanical jaw opened and closed silently, his eyes wide with shock. Around them, weapons came up. Stub guns, autoguns, even a jury-rigged plasma weapon that looked like it had a 50-50 chance of exploding. "I wasn't making a demand," Alucard said calmly, withdrawing his hand and letting the body drop. "I was offering mercy. But if you'd prefer the alternative..." His shadow expanded, spreading across the chamber floor like spilled ink. Eyes opened in the darkness, hundreds of them, thousands, the accumulated weight of centuries of killing made manifest. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. Frost formed on metal, and every gang member with even a shred of survival instinct took a step back. "The Covenant," Alucard repeated. "Where?" A woman stepped forward. Younger than the others, her left arm replaced with a crude mechanical prosthetic. "Deeper," she said, her voice shaking. "Level 103, the old Factorum district. But you don't want to go there, stranger. Things down there, they ain't right. People go in, they come back changed. Or they don't come back at all." "Perfect," Alucard said, and his smile returned. "Severine, stay here. This might get messy." "That's my job," the assassin protested. "Your job is to report back to Covenant. Mine is to hunt." He turned toward the deeper tunnels, toward the darkness that even these hardened criminals feared. "And I'm very hungry." He descended alone, leaving the Underhive gangers to their terror and Severine to her protests. The tunnels grew narrower, more twisted. The walls were covered in graffiti, some of it gang signs, some of it prayers to the Emperor, and some of it symbols that made Alucard's vision blur when he looked at them directly. Tzinch, the changer of ways. Covenant had explained the Chaos Gods during the voyage. 4 apocalyptic entities born from humanity's darkest emotions, each representing a fundamental aspect of existence twisted into nightmare form. Tzinch was change, ambition, scheming, and sorcery. His cultists sought transformation, evolution, and forbidden knowledge, which meant they were probably experimenting on those children. Alucard's smile vanished. He could tolerate a lot. He'd served monsters, killed for monsters, been a monster for centuries. But children were a line even he didn't cross. Integra Hellsing had taught him that. His master, his chain, his purpose had instilled in him the one rule that mattered: protect the innocent, or you're just another beast wearing human skin. The tunnel opened into a massive chamber that had once been a factorum floor. Ancient assembly lines stood frozen mid-task, their robotic arms locked in positions they'd held for millennia. And in the center, bathed in the sickly purple-green light of stolen lumens, was the cult. They numbered perhaps 50. Men and women wearing robes covered in symbols that hurt to look at. Their flesh was wrong. Some had extra eyes growing from their foreheads. Others had fingers that were too long, bending in too many directions. One man's mouth opened vertically instead of horizontally, filled with teeth arranged in fractal patterns. And in cages suspended from chains, hanging over a pit that glowed with warp energy, were the children. 23 of them, ages ranging from maybe 5 to 15. Dirty, terrified, some crying, others too traumatized to make sound. And standing at the pit's edge, arms raised in supplication, was a figure that made even Alucard pause. It was humanoid. Barely. Its body shifted constantly, never quite settling on a single form. One moment it was male, the next female, the next something else entirely. Its face was a constantly morphing mass of features drawn from 1,000 different people. And when it spoke, its voice was every voice speaking in perfect, horrible harmony. "Witness," it said, "the birth of transcendence. These children shall be the first. They shall shed their weak flesh and become something glorious, something perfect, something—" "Dead," Alucard interrupted, stepping into the light. "They're going to become dead, along with every single one of you." The demon, because that's what it was, he could smell the warp stink on it, turned its ever-shifting face toward him. "Curious, curious, curious. What are you, thing that should not be? You reek of death, yet leave. You carry souls, yet are not demon. You are a paradox, a mistake, an opportunity." "I'm your executioner," Alucard replied, drawing the Casual and Jackal. "And you've just made a fatal mistake." "What mistake?" Alucard's eyes began to glow, red light bleeding through the orange lenses of his glasses. His shadow expanded further, filling the chamber, and from it rose the screaming specters of everyone he'd ever consumed. "You threaten children," he said, his voice dropping to something cold and ancient and absolutely without mercy. "Where I come from, that's how you earn an eternity of suffering." The demon laughed. "In this universe, suffering is currency. Pain is prayer. You cannot threaten us with what we embrace." "Then let me show you," Alucard said. "What happens when pain meets something that's been suffering for 500 years and learned to enjoy it?" He opened fire, and the slaughter began. The cultists died screaming prayers to their twisted god, and Alucard made sure they died slowly. The first 3 went down to the Kasul, their chests exploding in sprays of corrupted flesh and warp-tainted blood. But unlike the demons, unlike the ephemeral horrors of the Imperium, these were still fundamentally human. Mutated, corrupted, damned, but human. Which meant when Alucard reached out with his will, when he grasped at their dying essence, he could take it. The sensation was like drinking battery acid mixed with broken glass. Their souls were wrong, twisted by chaos exposure, fragmenting even as he tried to absorb them. But there was substance there. Not much, maybe 10% of what a normal human would provide. But it was something. Fuel for his depleted reserves. He moved through the cultists like a crimson storm. A woman with 3 eyes tried to blast him with warp lightning from her mutated hands. He caught the energy, absorbed it through his palm, and used her own power to reduce her to ash. A man whose arms had fused into tentacles tried to strangle him. Alucard bit through the appendages, drank deep, and left the cultist a withered husk. "Stop him!" The demon shrieked, its voice cycling through panic, rage, and disturbing excitement. "Kill the anomaly. Feed him to the warp. Make him ours." 6 cultists charged as one, their bodies already mid-transformation into something that was more demon than human. Their flesh rippled with borrowed power, their screams carrying psychic weight that should have paralyzed their target. Alucard's shadow rose up and swallowed them. The darkness that surrounded him wasn't just an absence of light. It was a presence. The accumulated death of 5 centuries given semi-physical form. The cultists disappeared into it, and for 3 full seconds, there was only the sound of screaming. When the shadow receded, only bloodstains remained. But the effort cost him. Each use of his power in this universe was like running uphill through mud. The warp interference was constant, grinding, trying to unravel his very existence. He could feel the souls he'd just consumed already starting to fragment, pulled by the Imperium's incomprehensible hunger. He needed to end this. Fast. The demon seemed to sense his urgency. Its constantly shifting form stabilized somewhat, settling into something vaguely female with too many arms and a face that was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. "Yes," it hissed, "I see now. You are weak here, diminished. This universe rejects you as you reject it." But Grandfather Tzeentch could change that, could make you whole, make you more. Join us, dead thing. Become something transcendent. "I've heard that pitch before," Alucard replied, reloading with movements so practiced they were muscle memory. "From gods, demons, and monsters who all thought they could control me. They're all gone. I'm still here. That should tell you how those conversations end." "Then die defiant." The demon gestured, and reality bent. The Factorum floor twisted like melting wax. Machinery that hadn't moved in 10,000 years suddenly animated, their mechanical arms lashing out with impossible speed. The pit of warp energy erupted upward, tentacles of raw chaos reaching for Alucard with the single-minded hunger of a black hole. He dodged, weaved, and fired. Each bullet found its mark, punching through the demon's shifting form, but the wounds closed almost instantly. This wasn't like the Great Unclean One. This thing was smaller, weaker, but also faster, more cunning. It wasn't trying to overwhelm him with brute force. It was trying to exhaust him, and it was working. Alucard's regeneration was down to maybe 40% efficiency. The souls he'd consumed from the cultists were already mostly gone, burned up maintaining his physical form against the warp's constant pressure. His shadow forms were flickering, unstable. And worst of all, he could feel something pulling at him from the pit. The raw warp energy trying to drag him in, unmake him, reshape him into something else. "You cannot win," the demon taunted, its voice now carrying genuine confidence. "This is our realm, our rules. Your power means nothing here. You are just meat, just potential, just..." Alucard shot the chains holding the cages. The demon's monologue cut off mid-word as the suspended prisons plummeted. Not into the pit. Alucard's aim was too precise for that. But onto solid ground 20 feet away from the warp breach. The cages crumpled on impact, bent metal screeching, but held together enough to keep the children contained. And more importantly, alive. "You made a mistake," Alucard said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You assumed I was here to fight you. But I'm not a fighter. I'm a hunter. And hunters don't engage in fair fights." He holstered the jackal and placed his hand on the factorum floor. In his original universe, Alucard's power had been focused through blood, his own, his victims. The connection between life and death made manifest. But here in the 41st millennium, blood wasn't enough. The warp had taught him that. So he reached deeper, past the blood, past the physical, into the foundational concept of what he was. Death. Not as an ending, but as a claim. Everything in this chamber had died at least once. The cultists he'd killed. The machinery that had stopped functioning millennia ago. Even the factorum itself was a corpse. A dead thing pretending at purpose. And death recognized death, even across universes. His power spread through the floor like roots through soil. Invisible, inexorable. Claiming everything that had ever expired in this space as his. And then he pulled. The dead machinery animated. Not through chaos, not through the demon's power, but through Alucard's absolute authority over death itself. Robotic arms swiveled, their movements jerky and wrong, and slammed into the demon from 12 directions simultaneously. Ancient cutting lasers flickered to life, their beams carving through warped flesh. Assembly line crushers descended like the fists of an angry god. The demon shrieked, its form fragmenting under the assault. "Impossible! You cannot command the dead. That is not your domain. You are not..." "I am the king of the dead," Alucard interrupted, walking forward through the chaos, his coat billowing despite the lack of wind. "I have been Death's servant, Death's master, and Death's lover for 500 years. And in every universe, across every reality, Death has rules." He reached the edge of the pit and looked down into the swirling warp energy. It called to him, promised power, transformation, transcendence. All he had to do was fall, let go, become something more. Instead, he spat into it. "Rule 1, he said, raising the Khazal and pointing it directly at the demon's fragmenting face. "Everything dies, even gods, even demons, even things that claim to be eternal. They all die. It just takes the right application of will. You cannot..." "Rule 2, Alucard continued, pulling the trigger. "Never threaten children." The bullet punched through the demon's core. Not its heart, because it didn't have one, but the conceptual center of its existence. The point where its will intersected with reality. And in that bullet, Alucard had loaded something special. A fragment of himself. A single soul from his vast reservoir, compressed and weaponized, carrying his absolute denial, of the demon's right to exist. The effect was catastrophic. The demon's form didn't dissolve. It shattered, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that screamed in 1,000 voices before being sucked back into the warp. The pit's energy collapsed inward, the breach sealing with a sound like reality sighing in relief. The animated machinery ground to a halt, settling back into its eternal rest. Silence fell across the factorum floor. Alucard stood at the pit's edge, breathing hard, harder than he'd breathed in decades. His coat was shredded. His hat had been lost somewhere in the fight. And when he looked at his hands, he could see they were trembling. Not from fear, from hunger. He'd won, but the cost was severe. His soul reservoir was critically depleted. His regeneration was barely functional. And the warp's interference was worse than ever, like his body was rejecting this universe at a cellular level. Behind him, one of the cages creaked. A child's voice, small, terrified but alive, called out, "Mister, are we safe?" Alucard turned. 23 pairs of eyes looked at him from within the broken cages. Children, filthy and traumatized, but breathing, living, saved. And despite everything, despite the pain, the hunger, the knowledge that he was barely holding himself together, Alucard smiled. Not his usual predatory grin. Something softer. Something that might have been human once. "You're safe," he said, his voice gentle in a way it hadn't been in centuries. "The monsters are gone. He paused, considering. "I'm taking you home." It took 3 hours to shepherd the children back through the underhive levels. The gangers gave them a wide berth, apparently having spread the word that the corpse-pale stranger was not to be fucked with. Severine found them on sub-level 83, along with a squad of Arbites that Covenant had dispatched. The assassin took one look at Alucard, coat in tatters, hat missing, moving like every step was agony, and raised an eyebrow. "You look like shit." "I feel like shit," he admitted. "But the job's done. Cult eliminated. Children recovered. Your Inquisitor's test passed." "At what cost?" Alucard looked at his trembling hands again, at the way his shadow flickered and destabilized. At the hunger gnawing at him from the inside, desperate and demanding. "Everything," he said quietly. "And not nearly enough." The Arbites took the children. Medical servitors began immediate trauma assessment and decontamination protocols. Severine guided Alucard back toward the surface, supporting more of his weight than either of them acknowledged. "The Inquisitor will want a full report," she said as they ascended. "Tell him I learned 3 things," Alucard replied. "First, this universe is actively trying to kill me, but I can fight it. Second, chaos corruption makes humans barely edible, but it's better than starving. And third," he paused as they emerged onto a mid-level platform, looking out over the impossible expanse of Hive Aristeus. Billions of souls stacked on top of each other, grinding through existence in a galaxy that wanted them dead. "Third?" Severine prompted. "This universe has teeth," Alucard finished, his predatory smile returning despite his exhaustion. "Real teeth, actual challenges, things that can hurt me, things that might even be able to kill me if I'm not careful." "And that pleases you?" "Severine," he said, "I have been bored for 500 years. I have fought everything my universe had to offer and found it all wanting. But here," he laughed, a sound equal parts exhaustion and exhilaration. "Here, I might actually get the war I've always wanted." High above, in the unrelenting absolution, Inquisitor Covenant received Severine's report and made a note in his personal log. Subject Alucard has successfully completed first field test. Capabilities confirmed. Significant combat effectiveness against chaos entities, despite dimensional interference. Limitations observed. Power depletion requiring regular feeding. Vulnerability to sustained warp exposure. Recommendation: continue monitoring. The Emperor may have sent us a weapon or a catastrophe. Time will tell which. The Space Wolves came for him on the edge of the Aristeus system, their fleet dropping from the warp with the predatory grace of their namesake. They were not subtle. They were not diplomatic. They were the Emperor's executioners, and they had been sent a message. Inquisitor Covenant met them aboard the unrelenting Absolution in the ship's strategium, the air thick with incense and the ozone tang of active hololiths. Across from him stood Jarl Gunnar Redmane, a mountain of ceramite and fury, his beard a fiery red, streaked with gray, his one good eye burning with the cold light of Fenris. His wolf guard flanked him, their armor scarred, their expressions promising violence. You harbor an abomination, Inquisitor. Gunnar's voice was a low growl, the sound of grinding stones. A creature of darkness that defies the natural order. The Ecclesiarchy screams for its blood. The Ordo Malleus has filed a formal protest, and you have it on a leash, like a favored hound. The creature is a tool, Jarl, Covenant replied, his tone flat and unyielding. A weapon of immense potential. It has already purged a Tsenshian cult of significant power and rescued Imperial citizens. Its actions are documented. Its nature is a blight. Gunnar slammed a gauntleted fist on the hololith table, causing the projected star charts to flicker. It is not of the warp, yet it is not of the Imperium. It is a wrongness, Covenant, a splinter in the eye of the Allfather. My rune priests dream of a shadow with fangs, drinking the light from the stars. They say it must be ended. Your rune priests are not the sole arbiters of the Imperium's fate, Covenant countered. I have the authority to utilize unorthodox assets in the prosecution of my duties. This creature, Alucard, is such an asset. He is contained, directed. Contained? Gunnar laughed, a harsh barking sound. Is that what you call the reports from Sanctum Angelus? From the underhive of this very world? It butchered the Sisters of Battle. It feasted on the souls of heretics. It brawled with a greater demon in the streets. That is not a contained asset, Inquisitor. That is a wildfire, and I am here to put it out. Down in the bowels of the ship, in a chamber sealed with hexagrammic wards and guarded by Covenant's most trusted servitors, Alucard felt their arrival. He sat in the center of the room, cross-legged, attempting to meditate. The presence of the Space Wolves was a psychic tremor, a raw, primal force of nature that cut through the ship's background hum. It felt like a storm front approaching. It felt interesting. Severine entered, her movements tense. The Space Wolves are here. Their Jarl demands your head. Covenant is stalling, but he cannot refuse them indefinitely. They will test you. Alucard opened his eyes, a slow, crimson smile spreading across his face. Test me? Or try to kill me? With the Volca Fenrica, the difference is academic. She tossed him a data slate. Jarl Gunnar Redmane. He's killed 3 greater demons in personal combat. His company is responsible for the purge of the Garan Nime Hive fleet splinter. They are not the Ecclesiarchy's fanatics. They are warriors. They will not be impressed by parlor tricks. Good. Alucard rose to his feet, his coat flowing around him as if stirred by an unfelt wind. I'm tired of fighting amateurs. The confrontation happened in the ship's main hangar bay, a vast cavern filled with the roar of atmospheric engines and the scent of promethium. Covenant stood between the two forces, a lone, gaunt figure in black between a pack of snarling space marines and a single, smirking vampire. "Jarl Gunnar," Covenant said, his voice amplified by his armor's vox. "This is the subject. Observe and judge, but do not act without my leave." Gunnar strode forward, his power armor whining with each step. He stopped 10 feet from Alucard, looking him up and down with open contempt. "So, this is the great monster. This is what has the Ordo Hereticus so fascinated. You look like a court jester." Alucard tilted his head. "And you look like a walking brewery advertisement. I assume the facial hair is meant to distract from the lack of personality?" A low growl rippled through the wolf guard. Gunnar's eye narrowed. "You have a sharp tongue, creature, but tongues can be cut out. Many have tried." Alucard's smile widened. "They're all inside me now. Would you like to meet them?" Gunnar ignored the taunt, his gaze analytical. "Inquisitor Covenant claims you fight the ruinous powers. Why?" "They're annoying," Alucard shrugged. "And they keep trying to turn me into something else. I am what I am. I don't appreciate the unsolicited remodeling. A selfish reason, but honesty from a Xenos-tainted beast is still a rarity." Gunnar took another step closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his massive power axe, Fenris's bite. "Covenant says you cannot be killed. Is this true?" "It's been a very long time since anything managed it. We shall see." Gunnar moved with a speed that belied his massive size. One moment he was standing still, the next his axe was a blur of crackling energy, sweeping horizontally to cleave Alucard in two. There was no warning, no declaration of intent. It was simply an executioner's strike. Alucard didn't dodge. The axe bit deep into his torso, shearing through coat, flesh, and spine. The energy field discharged, cooking organs and vaporizing blood. The force of the blow lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into the side of a parked Thunderhawk, his body a ruined, smoking mess. For a moment, there was silence in the hangar, broken only by the hum of the Jarl's weapon. "See?" Gunnar said, turning to Covenant. "It can be killed. Your judgment was flawed, Inquisitor." Then a sound, a wet tearing sound, followed by laughter. The ruined body against the Thunderhawk began to move. Flesh writhed like maggots, bones snapped back into place with audible cracks. The massive wound across his torso sealed itself, the flesh knitting back together until only smooth, pale skin remained beneath the torn fabric of his coat. Alucard pushed himself off the hull, rolling his shoulders as if working out a minor cramp. "Is that it?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "I've had paper cuts that stung more." The space wolves stared, their weapons coming up. Even Gunnar took a half step back, his one eye wide with disbelief. "What sorcery is this?" "Not sorcery," Alucard said, taking a step forward. "Biology, or the lack thereof. You see, I've already died. You can't kill a corpse, you can only make it angry." He moved this time. He didn't teleport or turn to shadow, he just ran, crossing the distance in a streak of crimson. Gunnar was ready, his axe coming up in a defensive arc, but Alucard was faster. He slid under the swing, his hand shooting out to grab the Jarl's armored gorget. With a wrenching pull, he slammed the massive space marine onto the deck plating with enough force to dent the adamantium. The wolf guard roared and surged forward. Bolters roared, filling the hangar with thunder and smoke. Alucard stood over the stunned Jarl, his form dissolving into a swarm of shadows and bats as the mass-reactive shells tore through the space he'd occupied. The creatures swarmed the wolves, not attacking, but harrying them, getting in their way, biting at eye lenses and clogging weapon barrels with their bodies. Gunnar surged back to his feet, bellowing with rage. Enough tricks. He activated a rune on his armor, and a wave of null energy pulsed outwards. The runic wards of the space wolves, designed to counter the warp, slammed into Alucard's manifested forms. The bats shrieked and dissolved into smoke. Alucard's form recohered, stumbling for the first time. The null field was a different kind of pressure. Not the warp chaotic hunger, but a sterile, absolute negation. It didn't try to consume his power. It simply denied its existence. His regeneration stalled. The comforting presence of his accumulated souls grew faint, muted. "Ah," Alucard said, a genuine note of interest in his voice. "Now that's new." Gunnar charged, his axe swinging in a devastating overhead chop. This time, Alucard didn't stand still. He sidestepped, the axe blade scoring a deep furrow in the deck where he'd been standing. He lashed out with a kick that connected with the Jarl's helmet, the impact ringing like a bell. Ceramite cracked. Gunnar staggered but didn't fall, shaking his head to clear it. "You hit hard for a dead thing," the Jarl grunted. "You're surprisingly durable for a living one," Alucard retorted. They circled each other, the wolves forming a wary circle around them. This was no longer an execution, it was a duel. Covenant watched, silent, knowing any intervention now would shatter the fragile understanding being forged in combat. Gunnar came again, a faint high followed by a low sweep aimed at Alucard's legs. Alucard leaped over the swing, twisting in midair to deliver a crushing blow to the Space Marine's back. Gunnar absorbed it, pivoted, and backhanded Alucard with his power-armored fist. The vampire flew across the hangar, smashing through a stack of crates. He was up in an instant, his jaw already reknitting. Good. Finally, someone who understands the concept of a proper fight. For 10 minutes, they brawled. It was not a duel of finesse, but a brutal, savage exchange of power. Gunnar was a master warrior, his every move efficient and lethal. Alucard was an unstoppable force, his body a weapon that regenerated from any damage. He learned the Jarl's patterns, adapting his centuries of combat experience to the superhuman speed and strength of a space marine. Gunnar, in turn, learned that his enemy's seeming recklessness was a mask for a cunning, analytical mind. The fight ended when Alucard, after deliberately taking a glancing blow from the power axe, managed to get inside Gunnar's guard. He didn't strike a killing blow. Instead, he placed his palm flat on the Jarl's chest plate, over the twin-headed eagle. A pulse of dark energy shot through the armor. It didn't harm Gunnar, but it shorted out every non-essential system in his suit. The power axe's energy field died. The helmet's autosenses flickered and went dead. The Jarl was left standing in a suddenly silent, dark shell of ceramite. Alucard stepped back, lowering his hand. "Yield." Gunnar stood frozen for a long moment, his breathing loud in the sudden silence. Then slowly, he reached up and unclasped his helmet, pulling it off. His face was flushed, sweat-soaked, but his single eye held not defeat, but a grim, newfound respect. "You could have killed me," he stated. "It would have been a waste of a good opponent," Alucard replied, "and I've wasted enough in my long life." Gunnar looked from Alucard to Covenant, then back to the vampire. "You fight with honor, of a kind." He sheathed his axe. "The Allfather's dreams are not always clear. Perhaps the shadow with fangs is not here to drink the light, but to hunt the things that hide in it. He turned to his pack. Stand down. This creature has earned the right to exist. For now. As the space wolves departed, their thunderous presence fading, Covenant approached Alucard. That was dangerously close to a diplomatic incident. Diplomacy is boring, Alucard said, watching the wolves leave. But him? He understood. They all do. They're not fighting for faith or empire. They're fighting because it's what they are. It's in their blood. He looked at his own pale hand, flexing his fingers. I can respect that. The Jarl's report will reach the High Lords. Your existence is no longer my secret to keep. Let them come, Alucard said, his gaze turning inward, toward the core of the galaxy, toward the blinding psychic beacon he had felt since his arrival. Let them all come. But first, I have a question, Inquisitor. What is it? This All-Father he spoke of, this Emperor you all serve. Alucard's voice was low, intense. Where is he? I want to see this corpse god for myself. The journey to Terra was a descent into madness. The warp storms around the Sol system were thicker, more violent, as if the galaxy itself conspired to protect its dark heart. The unrelenting absolution shuddered and groaned, its Geller field flaring constantly against demonic assaults that felt more personal, more targeted. They were no longer random predators. They were guardians. Alucard stood at the viewport, his reflection a pale ghost overlaid on the chaos outside. He had not fed since the confrontation with the space wolves, and the deprivation was taking its toll. His form was less substantial, his shadow flickering in and out of existence. The warp's pressure was a constant, grinding pain, a weight that sought to unravel the very concept of his being. Yet, his focus was absolute. Drawn like a needle to a lodestone by the psychic beacon ahead, the Astronomicon, to any sanctioned psyker, it was a guiding light, the manifested will of the God Emperor holding back the darkness. To Alucard, it was a scream, a silent, endless scream of agony and defiance that resonated across 1,000,000 worlds. It was the sound of a king crucified on a throne of his own making, a monarch of corpses sustained by a ritual of sacrifice on a scale he could barely comprehend. It hurts to look at, doesn't it? Severine's voice was quiet beside him. She had taken to observing him during the voyage, a silent study in contrasts, the ultimate killer and the undying monster. It's the most beautiful and terrible thing I have ever witnessed, Alucard replied, his voice hushed. In all my centuries, I have never felt such concentrated will, such pain. He is in there, isn't he? Truly alive, after a fashion. He is the Emperor. He endures for us. No, Alucard corrected softly, his yellow eyes fixed on the distant, painful light. He endures despite you. There is a difference. He turned to her. You all pray to a corpse and call it faith. You build an empire on a foundation of perpetual suffering and call it necessity. I have seen empires. I have served kings. This is something new. When they finally emerged from the warp into the Sol system, the scale of it stole even Alucard's breath. It was a fortress. Battle stations the size of moons hung in the void. Patrol fleets numbering thousands of vessels moved in perfect, grim formation. The system was a clenched fist, ready to smash any threat that dared approach Holy Terra. And at its center, the throne world itself. Not a planet, but a monument. A hive city that covered a globe, its atmosphere a permanent soup of pollution and piety. The Imperial Palace was a mountain range of adamantium and rockcrete, a fortress so vast It defied comprehension. And at its heart, the source of the scream. Getting past the orbital defenses required every ounce of Covenant's authority and a dozen forged clearances. Landing on the surface was an exercise in bureaucratic terror. But getting into the Imperial Palace itself? That was impossible, even for an Inquisitor of Covenant standing. Which was why Alucard went alone. He became shadow. Not the metaphorical shadow of his power, but a literal absence of light, seeping through the microscopic gaps in the palace's outer bulwarks. He flowed through ventilation shafts older than his home universe, past sensor arrays that could detect a single mutated gene in a population of billions. He slid through walls inscribed with wards that made his essence curdle, past chambers where 10,000 psychers were sacrificed daily to fuel the Golden Throne. The closer he got, the heavier the pressure became. The Emperor's psychic presence was not merely light. It was gravity. It was a reality enforcement field that sought to crush any anomaly. Alucard felt his form straining, his borrowed soul screaming in silent unison, with the psychers being devoured. He was an intruder in a sacred tomb, and the tomb itself was fighting back. He emerged into a chamber so vast, its ceiling was lost in darkness. The air hummed with unimaginable power, thick with the smell of ozone, sanctified oils, and ancient dust. And before him, seated upon the Golden Throne, was the master of mankind. The sight struck Alucard with a physical force, driving him to one knee. He had expected a king, a warrior, a god perhaps. He had not expected this ruin. The Emperor was a skeleton swathed in ceremonial armor, a withered corpse held together by will and arcane technology. Wires and tubes fed into his desiccated flesh. His face was a skull, skin stretched taut over bone, his mouth open in a silent, eternal scream. The psychic light that blazed from him was a furnace, but the body was a cold, dead thing. And yet, the presence. It filled the chamber, the palace, the system. It was the weight of history, the burden of 10,000 years of brutal survival. It was the agony of a father who had seen his dream for humanity twisted into a nightmare of superstition and suffering. It was the determination to endure, no matter the cost, because to fail was extinction. Alucard, the no-life king who had consumed millions and laughed in the face of death, felt something he had not felt in centuries: awe and pity. "So this is it," he whispered, the words swallowed by the chamber's immense silence. "This is the king you all die for, a prisoner on his own throne, a light that burns itself to keep the dark at bay." He took a step forward, then another, each movement a struggle against the psychic torrent. He was not attacked. No custodes emerged from the shadows. The Emperor's presence did not lash out to destroy him. It simply observed. It weighed him, measured him, and found him curious. "You are not of this place." The voice was not sound. It was not telepathy. It was pure concept, implanted directly into his consciousness. It was the grinding of continental plates, the silent nuclear fire of stars, the whisper of a dying man's last breath. "No," Alucard said aloud, his own voice tiny and insignificant. "I fell through a crack. I am lost. Your existence defies the laws I sought to establish. You are anomaly, paradox. I've been called worse. A wave of, not amusement, but something akin to it. A flicker of intellectual interest in the endless ocean of pain. You carry death within you, yet you serve life. You have consumed innocence, yet you protect the innocent. You are a contradiction." "I am what I chose to be," Alucard replied, standing tall before the throne. "I was a monster, and then I was given a chain. A purpose. It is the chain that defines me, not the monster. Chain. The concept carried the weight of profound understanding, a willing servitude, a choice to be weapon rather than tyrant. I know this. The psychic pressure shifted. Alucard saw flashes, not visions, but understandings. He saw the Emperor not as a god, but as a man, a being of incalculable power and vision who had fought to free humanity from the very darkness that now sustained it. He saw the great betrayal, the sun struck down, the dream shattered. He saw the long, slow crucifixion on this golden throne, the ultimate chain, chosen to prevent a far worse fate. He saw the truth. The Emperor was not a god. He was a weapon, the ultimate weapon, turned against the darkness, his own body and soul the firing pin, and his empire was the shrapnel. "They worship you," Alucard said, the pity in his voice now undeniable. "They turned you into the very thing you fought against. Necessity. Faith is a tool. I became what humanity needed to survive. The alternative was extinction." "And is this survival?" Alucard gestured around the crypt-like chamber. "This eternal, grinding suffering? This empire of corpses led by a corpse? It is, and it must continue." The finality in that thought was absolute. There was no debate, no negotiation. The Emperor's will was a law of the universe as immutable as gravity. Endure, survive, protect humanity, even from itself, forever. Alucard understood then. He would find no kindred spirit here, no release, no worthy death. The Emperor was not an opponent to be fought. He was a force of nature to be weathered. He was the mountain, and Alucard was just another stone at its base. But even stones could be weapons. "You seek purpose," the voice thundered in his mind. "You seek a war worthy of your nature. I offer you one. The war without end, the war in the dark. Your war, mankind's war. Hunt the enemies that lurk in the frontiers, the ones the Imperium cannot reach, the ones too dangerous for even my sons. Be the monster that preys on monsters. Be the chain that binds the darkness." Alucard looked at the entombed Emperor, at the unimaginable sacrifice, at the brutal, ugly, necessary truth of the 41st millennium. He had spent centuries serving a family, a country, a world. Now he was being offered a galaxy. He smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "You are a far crueler master than Integra ever was," he said. "But the war is real. The war is all there is." Alucard bowed. It was not a bow of submission, but of recognition. One king of the dead to another. "Then I will be your hound," he said. "But I do not do it for you. I do it for the war." As he turned to leave, the final thought followed him, a whisper that would haunt him for centuries to come. "We are all prisoners of purpose, Alucard. The throne is mine. The darkness will be yours." They were waiting for him when he flowed back into his quarters aboard the unrelenting Absolution. Not Covenant's people, not the ship's crew, the custodes. They stood in perfect silent formation. 10 of them, their burnished gold armor seeming to drink the light rather than reflect it. They were taller and more imposing than the space wolves, their presence an absolute void of martial perfection. They did not fidget. They did not speak. They were living monuments, and their silence was a verdict. In their hands they held guardian spears, weapons that were both elegant and utterly final. Alucard coalesced from shadow, his form solidifying with a ripple of displaced air. The strain of his pilgrimage to the throne and the return journey was immense. He felt hollowed out. the psychic pressure of the Emperor's presence having scoured him clean. He was operating on the dregs of his power, and the 10 golden giants in his room represented a threat of an entirely different magnitude than anything he had yet faced. "Well," he said, his voice raspy, "this is a welcoming committee. To what do I owe the honor?" The lead custodian took a single step forward. His helmet was a work of art, a cold, expressionless mask of gold. When he spoke, his voice was like granite grinding, devoid of any emotion save purpose. "You have trespassed in a sanctum beyond your comprehension. You have stood in the presence of the God Emperor. For this, there is no atonement, only erasure. No discussion, no demands for explanation." The custodes were not inquisitors or warriors. They were extensions of the Emperor's will, and their will was clear. He was a stain to be wiped away. Alucard sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. "You know, I just had a very profound moment. A meeting of minds, you could say. A recognition of mutual purpose. Can't we just skip to the part where I leave and go kill things in his name?" The custodian's answer was the crackling ignition of 10 guardian spears. The power fields hummed with a frequency that made Alucard's teeth ache. This was not the wild fury of the wolves or the zealous fire of the sisters. This was a clinical, surgical determination to remove a cancer. They moved as one. There was no wasted motion, no battle cries. They were a single organism with 20 arms, their attacks coordinated with a precision that defied physics. 2 came high, their spears thrusting at his head and heart. 3 came low, aiming to cripple. The others flanked him, cutting off any avenue of escape. Alucard dissolved into shadow, but for the first time, it wasn't fast enough. A spear's energy field passed through the edge of his incorporeal form, and he felt a searing pain, a sense of permanent loss. Their weapons weren't just damaging his body, they were damaging his concept. They could kill him, truly kill him. He reformed behind their line, drawing the Casol and Jackal. The reports were deafening in the confined space. The massive rounds, which had staggered greater demons, sparked harmlessly off the custodian's auramite armor. They didn't even flinch. One turned, his spear deflecting the next 3 rounds with movements too fast to see. "Okay," Alucard muttered. "New plan." He unleashed his shadow. The darkness erupted from him, filled with the screaming faces of his consumed souls. It washed over the custodes, and for a moment, they were engulfed. Claws of solidified death scraped against gold, teeth of hatred bit at inviolable armor. It did nothing. The custodes stood unbowed within the storm, their armor glowing with a soft, holy light. The lead custodian simply raised his hand, and a burst of null energy, purer and more potent than the Space Wolves' runes, pulsed outwards. The shadow forms shattered, their psychic cohesion annihilated. The backlash hurled Alucard against the wall, the breath forced from his lungs. He was losing, badly, and he was too weak to fight back effectively. The lead custodian was on him in an instant, his spear thrusting forward like a piston. Alucard twisted, but the blade still took him through the shoulder, pinning him to the adamantium wall. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot agony that refused to heal. The spear's energy field was actively suppressing his regeneration. "Your existence is an error," the custodian stated, his blank helmet inches from Alucard's face. "We are the correction." He began to push the spear deeper, aiming to sever the spine and decapitate him in one motion. Alucard gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He couldn't outfight them. He couldn't outlast them. His usual tricks were useless. They were the absolute counter to everything he was. He had one card left to play, the one he had sworn to Integra he would never use unless the world itself was ending. He had come close once, against a fake priest in Brazil. But this was different. This was the end of his world. He looked past the custodian, at the other 9 golden giants standing ready. He looked at the certainty in their postures. They were the unbreakable wall, and he was the wave about to crash against it. "You want to see an error?" Alucard rasped, blood trickling from his lips. "Let me show you a fucking catastrophe." He stopped fighting the spear. He stopped trying to regenerate. Instead, he reached inward, past the pain, past the weakness, to the very core of his being, to the seal, the restraint that kept the ocean of death inside him from flooding out. The Control Art Restriction System, Level 0. He spoke the words, his voice a guttural, ancient curse that predated this universe. Crisscross, double crest, triple crest, zigzag, Arcanum seal release. The change was instantaneous and absolute. The air in the room, in the entire ship, vanished, replaced by a vacuum that screamed with the voices of the damned. The lights died, plunging everything into a blackness so profound it felt solid. The custodian's spear, still embedded in Alucard's shoulder, began to vibrate, then to crack. From Alucard's body, from his shadow, from the very air around him, they came. Not shadows, not illusions. An army. The spectral, semi-corporeal forms of every single soul he had ever consumed. Millions of them. Vampires, ghouls, Nazis, mercenaries, fanatics, innocent bystanders. A tidal wave of death-given form. They were no longer under his precise control. They were a released plague, a horde of vengeful spirits with only one command broadcast through their collective consciousness. Kill. The lead custodian was torn from Alucard and engulfed. His golden armor, which had shrugged off bolt rounds and shadow claws, was now assailed by 1,000 hands, 1,000,000 teeth. The other custodes reacted with flawless discipline, falling into a back-to-back formation, their spears creating a whirlwind of death. They killed hundreds, thousands of the specters with every second. But for every one they destroyed, 100 more took its place. The horde was not just in the room. It was flooding the ship. It poured through bulkheads, seeped through decks, a tsunami of ghosts that attacked anything living. Crewmen screamed as spectral hands pulled them apart. Servitors short-circuited as dead code flooded their systems. The unrelenting absolution became a charnel house, a haunted ship adrift in the void around Terra. Alucard, freed from the spear, slumped to the floor. The wound in his shoulder gaped, bleeding freely. Releasing Level 0 wasn't a technique. It was a self-inflicted wound on a cosmic scale. He had opened a vein and let his life's blood, the accumulated death that was his power, pour out. He was a king who had set his own kingdom on fire to burn down the castle gates. He watched as the 10 custodes, the pinnacle of Imperial martial might, were slowly, inexorably overwhelmed. They fought with a grace and power that was beautiful to behold, but they were a finite force against an infinite tide. One by one, they were dragged down, their golden armor buried under a mountain of screaming dead. The lead custodian was the last to fall, his spear shattering in his hands as a dozen specters that had once been Millennium Battalion vampires tore his helmet from his head. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming. The spectral army, its immediate targets gone, began to turn on the ship itself and on its master. Alucard looked at the swirling, chaotic mass of death he had unleashed, He had done it. He had proven that even the custodes could not contain him. He had brought the heart of the Imperium to its knees, and he felt nothing but a cold, vast emptiness. This wasn't victory. This was just another kind of damnation. He had wanted a war worthy of his nature. Now, drowning in the consequences, he wondered if he had finally gotten what he asked for. The silence after the storm was a physical weight. The only sounds were the drip of condensing blood, the groan of tortured metal, and the faint, chaotic whisper of millions of unrestrained souls. The spectral army, having slaughtered the custodes and much of the ship's crew, now milled in the corridors like a tide with no shore, their collective purpose spent. They were a weapon fired, its destructive force expended, but its lethal fragments scattered everywhere. Alucard leaned against the shattered wall, his body a roadmap of agony. The wound from the Guardian's spear still wept, a gaping hole that his regeneration, critically depleted by the release of level 0, could not close. He was a vessel poured out, hollow and cracked. The power he had spent was not just lost, it was actively turning against him. The souls, no longer bound by his absolute will, were beginning to perceive him not as their master, but as the source of their torment. A low, psychic growl of resentment began to ripple through the horde. He had proven his point. He had shown the Imperium that its ultimate guardians could fall. And in doing so, he had likely signed his own death warrant, and that of every soul aboard the unrelenting Absolution. Then, a new pressure filled the ship. It was not the clinical purpose of the Custodes or the wild energy of the warp. It was the same presence he had felt in the throne room, but now focused, directed, and impossibly amplified. The Astronomican's light, which had been a distant scream, became a localized roar. It did not flood the ship as a wave of destruction. Instead, it unwove. Tendrils of golden light, finer than spider silk and more potent than plasma, threaded through the corridors. Where they touched the spectral forms of Alucard's army, the souls did not scream. They sighed. The rage and hatred that animated them was gently, irrevocably smoothed away. The forms dissolved not into nothingness, but into a peaceful, radiant light that was then drawn back into the immense psychic beacon. It was not a banishment. It was an absolution. The Emperor was not destroying the souls Alucard had consumed. He was reclaiming them, liberating them from their eternal prison within the vampire and offering them to the cosmic cycle of the warp, purified of Alucard's taint. It was the ultimate counter to his power. Alucard did not just lose his ammunition. He lost his fuel, his history, his very substance. He watched, helpless, as centuries of accumulated death were systematically erased. The Nazi soldiers, the millennium vampires, the Hellsing traitors, all of them, their essence purified and released. With each soul that was taken, he grew weaker, thinner, more transparent. The pain was beyond physical. It was the agony of unmade memory, of a life being edited out of existence. Finally, the golden light receded. The ship was silent, clean, and empty of all but the corporeal dead. Alucard slumped to the deck, barely able to hold his form. He was a sketch now, a ghost of his former self. He had gambled everything and lost. The voice returned to his mind, not as a grinding concept, but with a tone of finality that brooked no argument. The demonstration is concluded. You have proven your potential for destruction, and I have proven my ability to neutralize it. The balance of power is established. Alucard coughed, a wet, ragged sound. So, this is it? You finally found a way to kill me. No. To kill you would be to release the remainder of your consumed essence, unchecked, into the warp. A nuisance I do not require. Furthermore, a weapon of your caliber, once understood, is too valuable to discard. A figure shimmered into existence before him, not a custodian. An image, a psychic projection of immense age and authority, clad in the robes of a forgotten time. It was the sigil of the Officio Assassinorum. You sought a chain, you shall have one, but not of blood, of purpose. The projection solidified into terms, a contract written in light and will. You will serve as an unregistered, deniable asset of the Imperium. Your designation, Hemlock. Your purview, targets beyond the reach of conventional forces, rogue inquisitors, demon princes nesting in the eye, Xenos overlords who hide bellow imperial law. You will be the monster unleashed upon monsters. Alucard stared at the terms. There was no negotiation. This was not an offer. It was a sentencing. And if I refuse? He whispered. The response was not a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Then I will disassemble you, soul by soul, until nothing remains but the memory of pain. The choice is not between servitude and freedom. It is between purpose and oblivion. He looked at the projection. He saw the targets flashing by. A world-eater demon festering in the ghoul stars, a Xenos cult that had hollowed out a night world, a renegade space marine chapter that trafficked with the dark gods. The war was real. It was endless. It was the only thing he had left. He had wanted to be challenged. He had wanted to find something in this universe that could give him a worthy death. He had found instead a master who would never grant him that release, who would use him until the stars themselves died. It was the most beautiful and terrible prison he could imagine. My master, Integra. She gave me a choice, he said, his voice a thread of sound. This is no choice. It is the only choice that ever mattered. Alucard closed his eyes. He saw the faces of the children he had saved in the Underhive. He felt the grudging respect in Gunnar Redmane's eye. He remembered the cold certainty of the custodes. This universe was a nightmare, but it was a nightmare with stakes. A war where losing actually meant something. He opened his eyes. The red glow faint, but steady. I am the bird of Hermes, he recited, the old familiar words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Eating my wings to keep me tame. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the psychic projection. A shock ran through him, binding him, branding him. The chain was forged. Go. The darkness awaits its hunter. The projection vanished. The Emperor's presence withdrew, leaving Alucard alone in the ruin he had created. But he was not as he had been. His reservoir of souls was a fraction of its former size, critically depleted by the Emperor's purification. His regeneration was slow, painful. He was diminished, but functional. A scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. He was no longer Alucard, the no-life king. He was Hemlock, the Emperor's personal hound. And the leash was very, very long. They gave him a ship. It was not a grand vessel, not a strike cruiser or an inquisitorial black ship. It was a Cobra-class destroyer, ancient and small. Its hull pitted by micrometeorites and its machine spirit sullen and resentful. Its name was the Penitent Scythe. It was a blade meant for a single, sharp thrust, then a quick withdrawal. It was perfect. Its crew was not crew at all. They were servitors, mind-wiped and lobotomized, their functions limited to basic navigation and life support. There were no human souls aboard to tempt him, no minds to corrupt. The Penitent Scythe was a coffin, and he was its restless corpse. His first target was in the Hadron Expanse, a region of space where Imperial authority was a rumor, and the warp bled into reality through 1,000 tiny wounds. The briefing, delivered via a one-time astropathic burst, was succinct. Target: Vorlash the Unbound, former Magos of the Mechanicus, now a demon prince of Tzeentch. Location: the Omniscient Lens, a space hulk drifting in the Graveyard of Saints. Mission: Termination. Sanction: Absolute. Alucard stood on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back. His coat was whole again, his hat perched at its usual angle, but he felt the difference. The comforting weight of his soles was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. He was running on fumes, his power a finite resource he could no longer top up with casual slaughter. Every expenditure had to be calculated. Every wound was a risk. This was his new existence. This was the chain. The penitent scythe slid through the void, its engines a whisper against the silent vastness. The Graveyard of Saints was a debris field of unimaginable scale. The wreckage of 1,000 ships, from ancient colony vessels to Imperial battleships, all tangled together in a silent, frozen orrery of death. And at its center, the Omniscient Lens. It was not a ship. It was a cancer. A demonic infestation given metallic form, its surfaces shifting and crawling with impossible geometry, glowing with the sickly light of raw change. No Imperial fleet could approach it. No boarding action could succeed. The very laws of physics were suggestions within its influence. The penitent scythe docked with a grinding shriek of metal, its auger arrays having located a stable-ish airlock. Alucard stepped across the threshold alone. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone, rust, and the psychic stink of ambition gone mad. The corridors writhed, walls becoming floors, ceilings opening into bottomless pits. He heard the whispers of Tzeentch, promises of power, of restored glory, of a return to his full strength, if he would only embrace the change. He ignored them. The promises of gods were always lies. He knew that better than most. He found Vorlash in what had once been an observatory. The demon prince was a horror of flesh and machine. A dozen mechanical arms sprouting from a torso that was more tentacle than body. His head was a single, massive optical sensor, surrounded by a halo of flickering data streams. The anomaly, Vorlash buzzed, his voice the sound of a corrupted data slate. The Hemlock, the Emperor's new pet. Come to put me down. You are diminished, vampire. You are a ghost of what you were. Join me. Together, we can unravel the secrets of this universe. We can become... Alucard didn't let him finish. He drew the Kazol and fired. The battle was not like his previous fights. It was not a display of overwhelming power. It was a hunt. He used the shifting geometry of the ship against the demon, appearing and disappearing through walls that were not walls, using his limited intangibility to dodge blasts of warp fire. He was efficient, precise. He aimed not to obliterate, but to dismantle. He shot out optical sensors. He severed mechadendrites with well-placed rounds. He moved like a surgeon, cutting away the demon's assets one piece at a time. It was brutal, clinical work. He was no longer a force of nature. He was a professional. Vorlash shrieked in frustration, his form unraveling as Alucard systematically destroyed the components that anchored him to reality. You fight like a mortal. You have become a tool, a thing of order in a universe of chaos. You are a disappointment. Order, Alucard said, reloading with a smooth, practiced motion, is just another word for intent. And my intent is to kill you. He saved the jackal for the final shot. As Vorlash's form destabilized, screaming back into the warp, Alucard put the massive round directly through the demon's core. There was no grand explosion, no cataclysmic release of energy. Just a final, fading screech, and then silence. The Space Hulk groaned, its reality-warping influence beginning to fade. The mission was accomplished. Alucard stood amidst the settling dust, his guns smoking. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Only the hollow ache of his depleted power and the cold weight of the chain around his neck. He had done what he was made to do. He had killed a monster. There would be another tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the end of time. He returned to the penitent scythe. The servitors minded their stations, oblivious. The ship detached from the hulk and turned back toward the void. There was no debriefing, no commendation, just the silent wait for the next target. He went to his quarters, a bare metal room with no comforts, and stood before a blank view screen. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single tattered playing card. The King of Hearts, a memento from a world that no longer existed, from a master long turned to dust. He was Alucard, the no-life king, bound to a corpse god in a universe of endless war. He was Hemlock, the Emperor's hound, hunting in the darkness so the Imperium could pretend the light still shone. He had found his war. It was everything he had ever wanted. And it was a hell far more exquisite than any he could have imagined. He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. Let the hunt continue. The saga of Alucard in the 41st millennium is not one of redemption or damnation, but of brutal, pragmatic symbiosis. He did not save the Imperium, nor did he destroy it. He became part of its ecosystem, a new apex predator introduced to a food chain already overflowing with horrors. The what if is answered not with a bang, but with the silent, eternal whisper of a blade being sharpened in the dark. The Imperium gained a weapon of terrifying precision. A being that could go where armies could not, strike targets that fleets could not touch, and operate with a deniability that even the most radical inquisitor could never achieve. In the centuries that followed, whispered legends would spread through the underhives and the command decks of rogue trader vessels. Tales of a crimson shadow in the void, a phantom that hunted the hunters of mankind. Demon princes would vanish from their infernal realms. Xenos hive fleets would find their synapse creatures mysteriously decapitated. The name Hemlock became a curse and a prayer in the galaxy's darkest corners. But the cost was the soul of the hunter himself. Alucard, the being who craved a worthy death above all else, found himself bound to a master who would never grant him that release. The Emperor, in his infinite, cruel wisdom, had given him the very war he desired, but on terms that made victory impossible and surrender unthinkable. Every battle won was just preparation for the next. Every enemy slain was replaced by two more. He was Sisyphus with fangs, forever pushing his boulder of carnage up a hill that had no peak. The thematic heart of this collision is the nature of purpose and the price of power. Alucard entered the 41st millennium as the ultimate free agent, a force of chaos in his own right. He leaves our story as a defined component in the Emperor's grand, terrible machine. His agency was not stripped from him. It was channeled. He chose his chain, just as he had with Integra. But this chain was forged in the cold heart of a dying star and would outlast civilizations. He traded the boredom of invincibility for the torment of an unwinnable war. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is the closest any being can come to a happy ending. The galaxy was not saved. It was not damned. It was simply made stranger, more dangerous, and infinitely more interesting. A new piece was added to the great game, and the board shook with the implications. The war without end had found its perfect soldier, and the no-life king had finally found a war that could never, ever bore him.